All politics is local. That trademark quip was from House Speaker Tip O'Neill. But not only is politics local, so is the news. And local journalism has been the backbone of American communities for centuries. But what about today, in the era of the 24-hour news cycle and amidst social media? What is the future of local news? Tom Shortell, reporter for the Allentown Morning Call and a member of the Morning Call Guild, joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Former House Speaker Tip O'Neill liked the quip that all politics is local, something he would actually say to reporters as they asked about national issues. And O'Neill was right. At the end of the day, communities, individuals predominantly cared and voted based on issues that were happening to them, that affected their families and their communities. And that was the importance, it is the importance of local news. Our local news reporters across the country, day in and day out, report on the news that's relevant to us and our everyday lives. But amidst the 24-hour news cycle, social media, digital news, the question is now, what's the future of local news? And here in the Lehigh Valley region, where our studios are based, the recent news that the Allentown Morning Call, a leader of local news in the Lehigh Valley, is shutting its physical offices. I'm joined today by Tom Shortell, reporter for the Allentown Morning Call, member of the Morning Call Guild, and a friend of our program. Tom, welcome back to Face the Issues. It is good to see you again.
Good to be back. Thanks, Sam.
It's always a pleasure to have you. Before we get started, let me start by asking, how are you and your family doing in an otherwise very chaotic 2020?
Yeah, it's certainly been the case. We're holding up well. My wife and I are expecting our second child right around Election Day. So that will, that's made living in a pandemic a little more interesting than it otherwise would have been. Not that it wasn't interesting enough, but we're holding up as well as you can expect under the conditions.
Yeah, that's exciting news. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, so no matter who wins the election, the Shortells have won. And so we
that's probably the best way to look at it. Yes.
I like that. I like that a lot. Tom, I want to ask you, get right to it. You are a reporter for the Allentown Morning Call. The Allentown Morning Call has served the Lehigh Valley region for over 100 years. It has been, if not the among the premier news sources for communities across the Lehigh Valley and beyond. There are so many things. The Allentown Morning Call has won so many awards over the years. I think all of us growing up either carried the paper or knew someone in our neighborhood who carried the paper. It has provided jobs for people from high school all the way up. It has really been a hallmark of the Lehigh Valley. And yet, very recently, there's the news that broke about the Allentown Morning Call will be shutting its physical office space, not the paper, but just the physical office space. I want to ask you, you work for the Call. We found out mostly because the Morning Call reported it, but how did you and your colleagues hear the news that the Morning Call was shutting its offices?
Well, we've been working remotely since March due to the pandemic. Obviously, it's not a great idea to be in the office if you can avoid it. So most of us have not been in the office, but we got an email on August 12th informing us that we would not be returning. Our publisher sent out an email to all the employees saying that as a cost savings measure, that this is going to be something for the foreseeable future, and that they will consider moving into another office space after the pandemic passes. There's no guarantee at this point.
Was this, what was the lead up to this? Was this due to COVID-19? Was this because of budgetary issues? I know we will get to a little bit later, a lot of local newspapers have been struggling with subscriptions and things like that. I mean, that's across the country. Was this really driven by the pandemic, or was there something else? I mean, is there a lead up here that we might not know about?
That's a great question. The pandemic certainly has not helped things. Mm-hmm. And I think that it showed to a lot of executives that they can still put out the paper routinely every day with people working remotely. So I think seeing that made some people more comfortable with the decision moving forward. That said, I'm not entirely convinced that that is the sole reason. The Morning Call is owned by Tribune Publishing, the company that owns the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, many other prominent large papers across the country. Morning Call is actually one of the smaller properties that they own. Tribune Publishing last year was its leading shareholder became Alvin Global Capital. They are a hedge fund that has been buys distressed assets, and these days newspapers are distressed, and so they have been wringing every last cent they can out of them. And one thing they've done through that is with real estate. They can move out of buildings, sell buildings, and kind of worry about how things operate after the fact. Alden owns the Pottstown Mercury News here in Pennsylvania. It's previously won a Pulitzer Prize, so has a proud history. They sold their building, and they're down to one reporter working in his attic. So it's hard to say with certainty unless you're in the room with the decision makers. But the pandemic certainly hasn't helped.
Tom, let me ask you this: the purchase of the Morning Call by Tribune Publishing was somewhat recent, if I recall correctly, within the last few years.
Depends on how you look at it.
Okay.
long time people in the community will say yes, it was recent.
Okay.
We've kind of bounced around ownership. We were. And this goes before my time. It's been Tribune since I've been with the paper, and I've been with the paper for 5 years now.
Okay.
People who have been in the Valley for decades will remember the Miller family, who previously owned it. Times Mirror owned it at one point. I'm not entirely up to date on the ownership chain, but yeah, it's we've been Tribune for several years now.
Okay, and I remember when this occurred and the leadership switches that you were talking about, you had at that time spoken and indicated that this may not necessarily be great for the future of the Morning Call, and you just referenced Pottstown Mercury. Is this something? What made you think that then? I mean, you've been proven right. What made you think that then? Is this something that you've seen in other papers? Is this a trend that you're seeing?
Yes, the hedge funds in general. And Alden in particular have a reputation for they're a hedge fund. They're not there for journalism. They're not there for the community service aspect of it. They buy distressed properties and they wring as much money out of it, and the money gets distributed to its shareholders. That's kind of the way they're designed to work. And if it's a bankrupt business or someone selling widgets or something like that, I mean, that's bad for the people working in that, who worked at that place, at that factory or whatnot. It's for newspapers, you have a little bit of that. You definitely have that same factor of it, but there's also the community service aspect of it that comes with these newspapers. I mean, we are businesses. I'm not going to pretend we're not. We need to make budgets, but people rely on us to make informed decisions about their community. We're media in general and newspapers in particular are critical for the health of democracy.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, let me ask you this: you mentioned that COVID-19 certainly didn't help the case. And with COVID-19, so many people work from home. The Morning Call has still been producing. You're still working. Someone might look at this and say, "Okay, but is a physical newsroom necessary?" How would you respond to that?
The physical newsroom certainly helps. And I think that people in other lines of business are experiencing the same things. That when you talk to someone face to face, sometimes you have some technical difficulties getting the Skype or Zoom or Teams, whatever you got. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily want to cooperate with you. Sometimes the person on the other end of it isn't the most tech savvy. So it can be difficult to get everyone in the same room like even a digital room, collaborating together. Then there's the other aspect of it where I've been reporting in the Lead Valley for about 10 years now. There are people who've been around longer than me, who have covered different beats, who have experiences that I don't have, that I can go to easily and say, hey, what's going on with this? What do you think of this guy? Has he been a good source for you in the past? Is this information accurate? And we can kind of bounce ideas off of each other. And you can still do that, but it's all done by text usually, and that relies on that person being able to looking down at the phone at that exact minute. If I'm working on a story on deadline, and that's the thing, all these stories need to be done for the next day's publication, and I don't look down at my phone until 5 o'clock at night, then I'm going to miss that text that person needed within 20 minutes of sending that text. Right. So it hurts that way, and it just writing is a craft. Like we are journalists. We're a lot of like ink stained wretches and getting the facts and getting them out quickly. But there's also like a craft to writing clearly, accurately, and you'll understand the point you're trying to convey. And oftentimes it just helps to turn around to the person next to you and say, "What's the word for this? What is the word I need? How would you approach this concept?" And so you can kind of bounce ideas around like that as well. And it hurts not having that. It's you can still get the job done, but it's that's messy. And also just the camaraderie. The newsrooms are a lot of fun, particularly on a busy election story or big breaking news, or if you're working together on like on a big investigative story. You kind of get this us against the world mentality, where the last big one that we had was the trial of Allentown Mayor Ed Pawlowski. Everyone had different special assigned jobs. My job was literally to be the guy in the courtroom waiting for the verdict to come in, and as soon as and wound up being convicted of one of the charges. But as soon as the first guilty plea came in, my job was to run out of the courtroom, call my boss, say he's guilty, and then have them throw up on mcall.com, Pawlowski guilty in giant letters, so that people knew in real time what was happening. And then after that was done, my job was to try to find jurors and like follow them back to their hotel and see if they would be willing to do an interview with me about the trial. And so it's this breakneck, like every second counts mentality, and that you don't really get that when you're sitting at home with Frozen on your toddler down like climbing on top of you. It's like the same.
Oh goodness, I think that's a really, really good insight into what you guys do every day and the importance of a newsroom that I think a lot of us don't see. Tom, I want you to hold that thought because I want to come back there, but we're gonna go to break first. We'll come right back, so don't go away. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Tom, thank you again for being here, and I want to pick up right where we left off. You were talking about the importance of a newsroom, and you said while you can produce a paper without it, having a physical newsroom and all the journalists together, bouncing ideas off each other, collaborating, certainly enhances the work that you do. And there's a camaraderie there where you really, really become a team unit. That's just lacking, even if Microsoft calls their program Teams. And to your point, Tom, I think there's, as we think in recent years, so many newer, hipper office spaces, if you will, like WeWorks, started moving away from individual offices and moving toward the idea of these open spaces for collaboration. So it almost seems as if the world was moving toward what the newsroom has been doing for so long. And then now you see these local newspapers where this is starting to move the other way. And my question for you here is, we read a lot about how local news is in trouble, whether it's financially or it's because of the prominence of major 24-hour news networks. What do you see as the biggest challenge facing local newspapers or local news stations?
There's a lot to that. A big part of it is just the way that Americans consume their news today. Like you said, the cable news is on 24/7, and there's always I'm not trying to suggest it's not necessarily accurate, but every channel generally has its own slant. Conservatives like going to Fox, liberals like going to MSNBC. There's people kind of like getting the perspective that they want on their news. Newspapers are not like the newspaper journalists are discouraged from doing that. You have the editorials and columnists who certainly put their own spin on things. And I have been a columnist in the past, so I certainly understand it. But it's not quite the same thing with local news. There's also the timing of it. Like the paper comes out in the morning. And while yes, you can go online and get your news there, and it is updated throughout the day, a significant portion of revenue comes from the sale of the paper. And the problem there is that companies are no longer advertising like they used to in print media. It's expensive, and they prefer going to digital stuff where they can get feedback on exactly what is working, what isn't, and almost instantaneously. They can see who's clicking on what links, and that gives them the confidence that this is working when this isn't working the way we wanted it to. And papers, like our online publications can, but the print media doesn't quite offer that same feedback.
Mm-hmm. And what adjustments do you think need to be made, or what adjustments have you seen made, whether at the Morning Call or elsewhere, to kind of accommodate for that?
Well, for local papers, they need, I think that it often helps to focus on that, the local news. You can't get that anywhere else. No one else offers that. I mean, here in Lehigh Valley, we have multiple media outlets. That's healthy. That's good. Competition is healthy. You have Lehigh Valley Live, which puts out the Express Times in Easton, WFMZ. There are dozens of local weekly papers that honestly do a better job of getting into the small townships and boroughs. The larger papers used to do that more often, but the staff isn't there anymore. I used to be the slate belt reporter for the Express Times, and I don't think there's anyone covering the slate belt full time anymore. That's third of Northampton County right there. It's not great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a huge portion too of Northampton County that you're talking about, the slate belt. And so if nobody is covering that, I mean, then they're really left without. Again, we talk about all news at the end of the day is fundamentally community driven, and if no one's covering it, then they're really left with nothing except for to go to larger regional or to national news.
Well, there's that, but that's not going to answer. The reason why local news particularly matters because it's the stuff that impacts you the most. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, people will talk about the presidential election, and I'm not disputing that that's going to have tremendous impact on people's lives. But the highest part of your tax bill comes from your school district. Mm-hmm. You need, and if no one's covering your school district, people may be a little more comfortable slipping a tax hike in there and hoping nobody notices. Right. I mentioned the slate belt a little while ago. We did have our story recently about Penardula High School and COVID affecting the students there, how they had to react to that. And that's a story that we kind of had to drop in on. We're still seeing issues like that where something big happens and people and reporters rush back in, but there isn't anyone there full time who would who would be keeping a closer eye on it and could see it happening sooner and potentially send up warning flags or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Tom, let me ask you this. I know as journalists, you see your job, and journalists everywhere see their job as, in part, as holding those in authority accountable. I mean, so whether this is a government or it's a company that's not doing what they're saying they're doing, and journalism are really our first line defense in this. What happens if local journalism goes away? Paint us a picture of what happens if we lose local journalism, we lose local reporters like you.
Well, then it really comes then you're really just hoping that everyone behaves themselves. You're hoping that the government acts the way, and that's you're putting people on the honor system, and like that's not necessarily the thing I'm most comfortable with. Like I own a home, I pay taxes, like, I want I want people in authority being held accountable for their actions, whether that's people misusing public funds or public trust, abusing their power, and stuff like this happens. Like major stuff doesn't happen all that often right now, but it's easier to slip that stuff through when no one's looking. I am technically the county reporter in Lehigh and Northampton counties. A few years ago, I was able to confirm that the former county executive gave illegal raises to some of his employees. It's not that, and they weren't like astronomical or necessarily inappropriate. It's just that he didn't go through the proper channel and get it done the way he was supposed to. And most of those raises wound up being approved after the fact, but not all of them were. So it's making sure people aren't in government. It's often making sure people aren't profiting off of tax dollars inappropriately. It's making sure that I'm not interested in necessarily getting debated on the role of police. There's enough of that going on right now, and I don't want to bog that down. But we can look into how police respond in certain situations and talk to third parties and say, is this an appropriate use of force or something along those lines? But I was on scene when police shot a man outside of Joint Park a few years ago. That case, the district attorney did prosecute and send it to trial. Not all prosecutors necessarily make that decision every time. And it helps to have media outlets looking after the fact and kind of like reporting on what factors went into that decision and how that aligned with how government typically treats situations like that. There's dozens of other issues and how things like this matter. If we can go back to public safety, about whether companies are. We had a report a few years ago about a local company that was releasing tremendous amount of carcinogen into the atmosphere around Lehigh Valley. But it's a particular carcinogen that wasn't tightly regulated at the time. So they weren't breaking any laws. They weren't doing anything wrong legally, but it created like legitimate health questions for the community.
Yeah.
So these are things that our alphabet reporters are doing that may not necessarily get addressed otherwise.
Yeah, things that I don't think we otherwise think about until it's too late, and hence the importance of local journalism. Tom, that's great information. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Tom, thank you again for your time and especially for the work that you do. And it was really impressed upon me as you were talking about the importance and the role of local journalism. You know, I spent, as you know, my career in politics, and every time we travel somewhere, another area of the state or another state entirely, wherever we travel, for us is always imperative to look at the local reports, look at the local papers to know what people there are thinking, what people there are doing. And that was that's the first way we connect with people in their various communities. I want to ask you this. I mean, the local journalism is so important. It is the backbone of America in so many ways. What can consumers do? What can communities do to support their local reporters and local journalism?
I get questions like this a lot for local government. I'm angry about this, or these numbskulls are messing this up. How do I get them to fix it? And my response is always be involved. Reach out to your local elected officials, yell at them, and make them know in no uncertain terms that you will not vote for them if they don't continue to do this. It's essentially what you need to be doing for your local media outlets and for newspapers in particular that are facing these financial problems. Reach out to the local editors, let them know what you think needs to be covered and where we're falling short. Reach out to corporate like Alden Global Capital or Tribune Publishing, and make them know that you're unhappy or satisfied, whatever you're feeling about it. Locally here at the Morning Call Guild has its own website, saveourmorningcall.org. where we are trying to organize the community, make them aware of what's happening locally, the efforts that we're doing to raise awareness about this. The Guild has gotten statements of support from Senator Casey, Representative Wild, Senator Pat Brown, both Allentown state representatives calling on the morning call to maintain an office in the community. And so just these are things that we're doing. We could use community support. But even if they don't necessarily want to get involved in the union battle with the company, they can reach out directly to the paper and tell them what you think of what needs to be done or how we can improve.
I think it's great advice. Again, local news supports the community, and it only works if the community is involved in return. Tom, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us and for all that you do. Stay safe, and we'll look to have you back at another time. That is all the time that we have tonight. My name is Sam Chen. Thank you again for joining us. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.